Hey guys, we just wanted to do a quick video on how to do the installation on your new TSW rebuilt shocks. We want to go through a couple things. Safety first, obviously. Spring compressors are dangerous. That's probably the most dangerous part of this. If you are doing it yourself, you can absolutely do it. You don't have to be a professional mechanic or anything like that. Just have the right tools and make sure you're having fun while you're doing it. Make sure you got a good beer too. So we'll get you started here in a second, and you're going to unpack your shocks, make sure everything looks good. We want to make sure you're happy. If you're not happy, my personal cell phone number is in the baggie in the crate. So if you have any issues, questions, concerns, give me a ring. We're here for you. We don't want any bad blood. We don't want anyone to be happy. We want to make sure you're happy in the end. So give us a call if you have any questions or anything wrong. Now, when you unpack your shocks, they're going to be wrapped. Obviously, take the wrapping off, make sure everything's good. Let us know if there's any issues. There shouldn't be. And you want to make sure that everything is there, which is basically the shocks, the bruise guards on the rear shocks, if you have rear shocks in your order. And once you take everything out, get your wheels off, and then we're going to start this installation here in a second. So I want to thank you again. I appreciate your business. If you have any concerns, please let us know, and we'll get started here now. So we're going to start with a few things. You're going to get a 21mm socket, preferably with the impact. These ball joints typically get stuck on there and get a little bit of rust and corrosion on the ball joints and the tie rod. So it's a lot easier with the impact. It's not necessary, but it's going to make, again, your life much easier. We're going to start with your tie rod. Go ahead and zip that off. And your upper control arm ball joint. After you have these off, you can, there's a few ways to do it. It's completely up to you. You're not going to really mess anything up, but you want to start with this to get these out of the way. Kind of makes your life easier with the rest of the bolts. You're going to have 3 bolts on top. They're a 15mm. You're going to need to either go up through the engine bay. If you have something like we have, like a ratchet wrench, you can get in here through the side, which is what we'll be doing today. So 15mm on that, 21mm, 21mm. And then you're going to need a bigger socket down here for the main shock bolt, and then everything's going to slide out. You also need a 10mm to hold on the brake line bracket here to get that out of the way. And then you're going to be very careful with your IWE vacuum lines here, not to overstretch them or snap anything like that. They do get dry, so you want to make sure you disconnect anything possible that might get in the way, or not let it from extending all the way down. The sway bar end links are optional. You don't have to disconnect them. We typically don't. But if you want to go through with that, you get a little bit of extra droop, a little bit more freedom with getting everything out, and easier to work on. So next we're going to go ahead and disconnect the tie rod and the upper control arm. Big hammer's good for this. You're basically just going to loosen up the joints by giving it a little bit of a shock. You're going to hit right here on that edge a couple times, and then very carefully you're going to hammer up on the end of the tie rod, not hitting any threads or anything, but just light tap, and that'll come out. So get that out of the way. You can leave this off. I like to just put it back in there loosely. That way it catches it when you do the upper control arm. Before you do the upper control arm, we're going to get the IWE lines out of the way and the brake line bracket, so we don't overextend that and damage those. 10mm brake line bracket on the frame.
Should have brought my other camera.
Make sure once you take the bolt out that you actually remove the bracket from the frame. It can get jammed in there, and you're not going to get the movement you need. You just don't want to overextend this brake line, especially on factory ones being the rubber. Next, we're going to take the hammer, do the same thing. Careful not to hit the threads here, and basically hit on the side of the spindle or the knuckle in order to release that from the upper control arm ball joint.
Pay attention.
So again, right here, very carefully, and this is going to drop once we hit it. That's okay. As long as these are disconnected, everything's out. You don't have to worry about that. So, right like that. And then you can take your tie rod, and that just slips out. So now you gain all this access once you get those two things out, and it's much easier to work with everything. The next two things are going to be the main shock control arm bolt down here, and then the 3 bolts on top, 15 millimeter. We're using a 30 millimeter socket for the main nut on the bottom here, and then a good breaker bar or even a ratchet to hold that on the other side. What you can do is leave this back in, put that tie rod in there loosely, and then that way it's not bending towards the back, rotating towards the back, so you have easier access with your impact gun or ratchet. So we're going to put that on there. That big nut comes out. And then we're going to go ahead and get the 3 nuts on top, off of the top hat that go through the frame. All right, so 3 15 millimeter nuts on the top of the frame. Again, like you said, if you don't have a ratchet wrench, or you don't want to do slowly with a ratchet and you have a regular impact gun, you can pop the hood, get a good little extension, maybe 1 foot long, and go down through the top to these bolts. We're just going to use this for right now. So now those 3 are off, we're going to go ahead and get the bolt out. There is tension on the shock on this lower bolt until you loosen the top nuts. Once those are...
We're hot.
And now you can take this bolt out, just slides out. And then at this point, you're able to remove the shock. Now, sometimes you're going to have a little bit of load on it. You're going to lift up. And if it does hit right here on the control arm, you can gain some access by putting a big breaker bar or something with leverage right here on the control arm. Push down, and it pops out. Once you get that, it just slides on out, and there's your strut assembly. So now you can take it over to the spring compressor and put the new shocks on the springs.
We hot if you want to talk.
You're hot? Okay. So the best thing to do when you go ahead and take your, before you take your spring off the strut, is go ahead and mark everything in line. And that way you know exactly where it goes back. So usually the top hat, the rubber isolator, everything's going to stay on, so you don't have to worry about it. But the last thing you want is to assemble everything and you don't have it in line. Basically the strut will be clocked incorrectly, and you'll have to reclock it and redo it. So we're just going to go ahead and mark the wedge on the top hat, rubber isolator, and then as good as you can, just a little mark on the spring there. And that way, once you put it all back together, just line those up and you're good to go. Go ahead and compress the spring a little bit. If you're on bottom perch, you don't always have to do that. We still recommend it either way. This is on mid perch, so it has a little bit more spring to it off the truck. But you can basically take your impact gun, put it on this top nut, now we're going to go ahead and impact the main nut on the top hat where the strut goes through, the main shaft. We're going to go ahead and zip that off. Make sure if you are on mid perch that you have it compressed when you do this, because especially on top perch or mid perch, there is spring pressure. It's going to pop off pretty violently if it's not in compression with a spring compressor or all on the ground. If you're on bottom perch, there's not a lot of pressure. You can go ahead and just zip it off on the ground. You don't need to do this. But if you do have a wall mount like we have, It's a lot easier just to put the spring on. You can disassemble everything, and then everything just goes right back on. You don't have to worry about any of this. So if you're using a small, Harbor Freight, auto parts store, rental, basically the two-piece spring compressor, just be very, very careful. Make sure everything's seated on the spring here. You're basically going to be using this part and this part, not the top here with our spring compressor, and it's going to be a little bit more difficult, but just make sure everything's good, because you can get injured with this stuff. So we're going to go ahead and zip this off really quick.
There she is.
There she is. So once this is off, the strut will come out the bottom. You're going to have your foam bump stop here. We're going to save that and clean it up. You're going to have your plastic isolator here on the bottom. You can clean that up. And then you're going to have typically a dust cap right here. So this just pries off the dust cap. You're going to put that on your new rebuilt shocks. And then you're going to go ahead and do the same. Transfer this on. Once you put the new ones on, that just slides on. Make sure that is clocked all the way up against the collar. And then same thing with the bump stop. That's just going to slide. Now this, you're always going to have the words facing up, the small side down, and this flat part locks into the top here under the top hat. So you're always going to put it on like that, and once everything's back assembled, you can slide it up and it pops into position.
You shall not pass!
To go.
All right, so we got our plastic isolator on the bottom here, back on. This dust cap slides on into the two holes on the top of the shock. Press that in, and as before, bump stop, and go ahead and just put that all the way down for now. Slide her on up. And then take your nut right here. By the way, this is a 17 millimeter. Go ahead and just get that started. Hold the spring, or then the strut in place. And then we're going to go ahead and retorque that to spec. But this at least gets it on for now. We can lessen the spring pressure. Pull it off. And that is your assembled front strut.
All right.
So now we're going to take our assembled strut assembly. The thin part is always going to face you away from the engine. Obviously SVT is going to face forward. And your bottom bushing is going to go right back in the slot on the control arm. So you're going to go ahead, find the holes on the top of the frame. This is where this leverage comes in. It just pops in like that. You can go ahead and get rid of that. Now again, a couple ways to do it. You are going to want to Loctite all your bolts, especially this bottom one. This gets pretty high torque on it, and you just want to make sure everything is tight, doesn't come loose. So you can go ahead and put this through now. Next, you're going to get your 15 millimeter bolts. They're going to go on the top here. This wedge, if it does fall out because it's not secured after you take the nuts off, the thickest side is going to be facing towards you. So you're going to put that back on. Make very carefully sure that your vacuum line right here on the IWE line is not pinched and under this collar, because it will ruin it. So go ahead and get that. Now with a little bit of upward leverage, you can raise that up, get a nut started. I'm going to go ahead and tighten these up.
And we're good.
All right, so now that we have our nuts tight on the top, we're going to go ahead and move this into position. This can be hard to get in sometimes, but you're basically going to have your 21 millimeter nut ready. Sometimes if you have enough leverage, you can just push down, the easiest way, again, is if you have a breaker bar, go ahead and just put it in here very carefully, right under the spring, and then you can use that as leverage to push this down. If that's not enough, get it on the next coil, go ahead and push that down. Now you can get your nut on. Same thing, grab your nut, tie rod, get it on by hand first. Now, with these tie rods and ball joints, they like to spin if the threads are gummed up, if they're rusted. The best thing to do again is if you have some sort of leverage, go ahead and put it between the spring and the control arm, or you can put it right here under the spindle and get some pressure down, push down on the joint to where it grabs and you can suck that up. You have to put the brake line bracket back on the frame. Again, get that hand started first. Go ahead and tighten up your lower shock bolt. So this is the most important part of the torquing sequence, is going to be this lower bolt through the shock that goes through the lower control arm into the shock. If you don't have this tight enough, you will get a knock or a clunk under low speed bumps, and then you're also going to get a little bit of damage from the threads on the bolt up against the aluminum control arm. So you want to make sure this is tight. 406 foot-pounds. We got to use this guy. Normal torque wrench, maybe 150, 250 at most. This is a 600 foot-pound torque wrench, so we're going to go ahead and do 406 foot-pound. If you can have someone hold it or put it up against the frame for leverage as you torque down, there's going to be a lot of torque on this, so you're going to want to make sure that this is stationary. Otherwise, that bolt's just going to spin. There we go. Go ahead and torque your upper control arm and tie rod. You're also going to want to torque your top hat bolts up through the frame, those 15mm bolts. We're also going to re-secure your IWE lines if you cut them. Cut the bracket, just make sure they are secure on there. You don't want these coming off because they will rub the tire and then you're going to have even more problems. So make sure these are secure on the top of the knuckle and the upper control arm. And that is it. The only thing you're going to want to do is, if you haven't already, I usually leave this foam bump stop here on the shaft all the way down, or about halfway down, to where if we are putting any tools in here, that you don't damage the shaft. Any damage to it can cause a premature leak. You don't want that. So once you're done, you can go ahead and slide in here and pop this up into place. You'll feel it snap in, and that'll secure it in there. You're also going to want to, after the break-in period, about 400 to 500 miles, go ahead and wash off the base of the shaft right here where it comes out of the shock. There will be a little bit of weeping. Is completely normal. They are pretty lubricated for no dry break-in periods, and you want to make sure that any seeping out of there, you should have a little bit. That's completely normal. Go ahead and just wash it off with the wet rag, or power washer is fine too, and make sure that that's not collecting dust or dirt. And that's about it. Go ahead and throw the tire back on and torque everything to spec on the wheel, and you're back on the road riding smoothly again. All right, now for the rear, it's a lot more simple. There's 2 bolts, 2 nuts on each side. You're basically going to take your shock when you get it out, make sure everything's good on it, and there is a nut up here and a bolt up here, 15mm and 18mm. Just zip those off, top, bottom. You're going to put the new shock in, roost guard the front of it here with the most surface area. It's going to go towards the front. The reservoir is going to go towards the back. You can slip it in through the top or through the bottom. Please make sure, this is very common, people kind of just drop these shocks and they scratch up all the anodization, and then it doesn't look good for the next guy on the exchange program if you're doing so. And the shocks will be a bit long when you go to put them back in. The easiest way is if you go ahead and get the top hung first, put a bolt through it loosely, and then if you have a helper, get the truck jacked up all the way, and then go ahead and have someone push down on the tire, and then you can get that lower bolt in. Now, if you don't have that ability, you can definitely put it on jack stands, take off the tires for a little bit more droop, and then you're able to get some load on there and get that bolt in. And torque to spec, and you're good to go. Thank you again.
Sweet. All right, we're good, right? That's
Yep.
it, right?
We're good.
All right, we're good. All right. All right.